A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, everybody, we're here today with Stefan Simond, a game studies scholar from Germany. Stefan teaches and researches at Philipps University Marburg and Wuppertal University. He has a weekly podcast on game studies and video game culture that we love called Studying Pixels. Check it out. It's brilliant. He's currently working on his PhD dissertation on madness in video games, which we are super excited to talk about. This idea of how madness is depicted in video games. Stefan is a returning guest. So, Stefan, welcome back to the show.
Yay! I'm so glad to be here again. Thank you for having me again. Because the thing is that if you are a guest once, then that's cool. But if you're a guest twice, that means you haven't done everything wrong. So I guess it's a good sign that I'm allowed to be back.
Or maybe you did everything right. Right? I think by the time you return third time, which we would like to find out some way to bring you back, you'll be officially a friend of the show.
That's right. VIP. Maybe I get front row seats at a live show.
That's right.
For the live show, yes. All right. So let me first of all say that, I'm really excited about this episode from a personal perspective. My family has been very interested in this topic of how madness is depicted. This is partly because my brother-in-law was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was 19 and then lived with it for 20 years until he committed suicide. Our family has kind of lived with it, or my wife's family, rather, has kind of lived with mental illness at the forefront of their life. And the depiction of mental illness has been a really big part of that. My father-in-law has written a book about the depiction of mental illness in essentially art. My wife is working on a documentary on schizophrenia. But in our many conversations about mental illness, not once did we talk about video games. And Stefan, you're the first person I've ever heard of actually tackling the subject, which pretty awesome to have you to get your expertise on it.
I think it's still a bit of a niche subject, I think. That's also why I picked it, because when you're doing a PhD, then you want to address some kind of subject where there's still like a surprising lack of research. And for me, by the way, I also have a history with mental illness, not personally, but within my environment, within family, within friendship circles, and so on. And therefore, I just thought it's high time to properly look into this in the context of video games.
Let me start with this. You've been working on the way video games depict madness, and notice you use the term madness, right?
Yeah.
And madness is a term that can mean a lot of different things to people. Why did you choose the term madness as opposed to, let's say, labels like insanity, right, in video games, or mental illness in video games, or craziness in video games? Do you see any difference between them or the sort of things they imply to people? And by the way, I'm assuming you're writing your dissertation in German. Do German words divide these things in the same way?
Well, I'm writing entirely in English, so that thought doesn't really apply there. But there would be a difference. Yes, there would be a difference between madness and the German Wahnsinn, although it's as close as you can get when it comes to translating. But I'm working in English anyway, so we can stay on that side of the spectrum. But I think you're very much right. It's a peculiar choice of terminology, maybe, and I know that some people might take umbrage with it because mad or madness can have a derogatory implication, right? But I think it's important for, well, at least two reasons, maybe. One is that it is a contested term. It's one that is used in a derogatory sense, but also there is a movement trying to reclaim the term, much like it has happened with the word gay, for example, where it was first used in a completely different way, and then it was used as an insult, and then people have reclaimed it and said, like, hey, gay pride. And in a similar way, there is such a movement like a mad pride movement that says we are mad and we are proud of who we are. We don't want to be ashamed. On the other hand, I also think there is an academic reasoning behind it as well. Because in the discourse revolving around this phenomenon, madness has been coined as kind of the hashtag in that context. There's an important book by French philosopher and sociologist Michel Foucault. It's called Madness and Civilization.
Right.
And I think that was very influential in just basically framing madness as like a key term in the humanities. And it's so different from things like mental illness, for example. Mental illness, to me, is a term that has a medical implication. When you think of mental illness, in order to be ill, it's kind of a deviation from the concept of health. And so you always think in the terms of medical, of diagnoses, of therapy, and so on. Whereas with madness, it's a lot more abstract. It's something opposed to reason, but it's very abstract on a very like high level of abstraction that you can't really grasp. And that can be a good thing because it liberates the term.
When I think of the word, the word makes me think of book titles and film titles and things. So I have this sort of like association with art with this. Like it's the artful term to talk about anti-reason, or something where something affecting the brain, as opposed to a medical thing, like you say.
It's interesting, by the way, even just how those two terms, anti-reason, right, is very, very neutral, right?
Yes. I was trying to be very, very neutral.
No, and that's great, right? Something affecting the brain already is beginning to sound less neutral, right? And it's interesting when you mentioned the difference between mental illness, I immediately started thinking, so we're talking about things that are listed, let's say, in the DSM, the DSM-5, or listed in the World Health Organization list of mental illnesses, right? And that really does restrict it also in that sense.
Yeah, it already puts a specific framework on the phenomenon that we're talking about, which is a medical one. And this idea of anti-reason, I find that very compelling because it indicates, we can say anti-reason, but we can also say that reason is kind of anti-madness. Because reason and madness, the two of them, they really need each other in order to define what they are. So we can only know what reason is if we know what not reason or anti-reason is, right? And we try to, ever since the Enlightenment at least, our society is like super focused on emphasizing we need to be reasonable, we need to be rational. Madness is not a legitimate form of discourse, basically, and so we need to effectively exclude it from the domain of reason. I think that's like a super interesting tension that emerges there that is very worthy of academic inquiry.
I want to ask you guys, when you think of madness, what sort of conditions come to mind? And maybe, Andy, start with you, because you're not because Stefan is the expert here. So I'm kind of curious to like a regular person, like what sort of mental conditions come to mind when we mention madness?
Yeah, I'll answer that. And I also want to say that the word gets used in sometimes a romantic sort of situation way, right? Where like everybody has to go mad a little bit. Like that's sort of a thing that people should do. People should go mad once in a while, right? People should, I'm not sure what even that means, except that there's this romantic notion of like just jettisoning reason for a moment or a day or, a weekend or something like that, right? So, but no, going back to your question though, I think of schizophrenia. I think of all the classics. Honestly, the Batman supervillain cadre, right? So you've got Joker, and he's a certain kind of mad, and you've got Riddler, and he's a different kind of mad, and you've got Two-Face, and he's a different kind of mad. But they're all mad, right?
Though, yeah, interesting, right? You started with one specifically diagnosed mental illness, but then you gave us kind of images of characters that we think of as mad, right, without a kind of diagnosis, which is the two ways we could think about it. Stefan, so do you view it that way, or do you kind of do you separate them into categories of madness? Like what do you think of when you think of madness?
Yeah, I basically would distinguish between three broad fields in which the term is floating around. One is the medical one, of course, the psychiatric domain. And this is the most dominant one, arguably, right? Schizophrenia, of course, psychosis, depression, these things come to mind. And of course, we know that schizophrenia, we've mentioned it a couple of times now, and we should probably predicate it by saying that it's one of the most misunderstood afflictions and most misrepresented afflictions in being completely conflated with personality disorder, split personality disorder. But this is only one form. Another form would be a sociological or social usage of this idea of madness, which would entail, for example, the fact that we've got patient roles and doctors' roles. Like, how do these people function within certain institutions? What legitimizes their power? What are the tools they use to access a person's mind or a person's self in order to change it? You know, what is the standard that they're trying to reach, or what are the conformities within such institutions? So there's a whole lot of things that are involved there as well. So that would be a sociological domain. And the third one is the one that Andy also jumped into, and I totally agree with making such a shift deliberately, would be art, culture, media, of course, where we have such things like the supervillain, the mad scientist, the traumatized hero. Like, there's so many different tropes of madness, and they are super interesting and very much worthy of inquiry. I think even without necessarily directly normatively assessing whether they're good or bad, but just to see what they tell us about madness.
So we've got a wide range of possibilities of inquiry here, right? And notice, right? I think even when it comes to the mental illness part, there's questions about how much are you going to, what are you going to talk about? For example, is PTSD going to be a part of what you're going to include in madness, or autism? Anxiety, attention deficit disorder, right?
Yeah.
Like what? So how do you decide what when you're looking at how video games are looking at madness? How did you decide what to look for, what to exclude?
Well, maybe one thing that I want to still add to this distinction between these three different types of madness that I've just introduced, I think it's important to keep in mind that these different fields of madness are interrelated, very closely connected, and not just in one direction. For example, the way that madness is depicted in the media and has been depicted in the media for centuries is largely influenced by how, for example, early forms of medical documentation have been done, such as, taking photographs of people that are, considered to be mad, and then putting them on display and saying, like, this is how a mad person looks. Okay, so this is kind of a look that's adapted into the media. And it goes both ways. The same way that the other way around, it would be the case that the way that, for example, psychiatrists as characters are depicted in the media, that can have a huge influence on whether people feel comfortable going to a psychiatrist, right? So these different fields, they influence each other. They're not independent.
Yeah, so to go back to the question,
Going back to the question of how do I decide which kind of afflictions I would consider for my PhD? Of course, there needs to be a kind of pragmatic sample that needs to be created.
Right.
And actually, I pondered that early on in my PhD, whether I should limit the potential scope of madness in some form. And I thought it doesn't really work, because not everything that you see in a video game can necessarily be ascribed a diagnosis. Some things are just way more abstract. If you go into a mindscape of someone and so on, do I really need to sit down and with a DSM in front of me and think about what kind of diagnosis this would be? I don't think that would work. So what I would do is I would say substance abuse is something that I've excluded a bit, because I think it's just a rather specific phenomenon. But apart from that, I mostly went by video games. I have a small sample of video games and I'm doing a qualitative study. So I'm not having like hundreds of games. I actually have 5 to 6 video games that I'm analyzing very much in depth, like in a whole lot of time on individual sequences. I try to choose games that are contrasting each other. So if I would have a horror game, then maybe the next title that I should choose is an adventure game. If I have a game that's like very much that stigmatizes madness or mental illness significantly, then maybe the next game that I choose is one that tries to empower people, tries to be authentic about its representation. So that's kind of the way that I went about this. And then, of course, there was a bit of personal preferences that came in of how accessible these games were, how well I knew them already, so that I had like a small sample that I could use.
So they're basically exemplars of different ways that madness is depicted.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about? I guess I want to start with your motivation and everything, but now I'm dying to know which games we're talking about. So.
Yeah. Well, the games that I have finished my analyses on so far are Outlast, The Town of Light, Depression Quest.
Actually, Stefan, can you tell us about each of these? Just a brief blurb and just really quick how madness kind of generally fits into what they do.
Of course. So Outlast is a horror game in which you play a journalist exploring a horror asylum. You can't defend yourself, you just have a camera, and you have to walk through these corridors, and you've got these mad inmates chasing you. And you're trying to uncover some kind of secret experimentation going on at the heart of this facility. The Town of Light is a much different game. It's probably one of the least known games in my sample. It's an Italian indie game where a small studio wants to tell the story of the Ospedale Psichiatrico di Volterra. That's its name. It's like in Tuscany, an old institution that's completely derelict by now. And they are telling the story of an inmate in the 1940s and 50s and what happened to her. And they try to like incorporate original documents. They scanned documents. They did a whole lot of research and have you explore that kind of asylum. Very slow paced. There's no danger involved. It's a walking simulator, basically. Then there's Depression Quest, of course. That's probably one of the most well-known ones. A text adventure in which you play a person, I think someone in their 20s, going through depression, and you have a vignette of daily experiences and always make a choice about how you want to act. And the degree to which you are depressed in this game limits the options that you can choose. So you might think, oh, cool, I should really like, my girlfriend wants me to go to a party, and that would be wonderful because I could just like relax and experience something different and we could have a good time. But that option is crossed out because you are depressed. So you see the option, but you can't choose it. Very painful. And then there's a title called Franbo, which is about a little girl. It's very much inspired by, you can imagine it's just like Alice in Wonderland, really. A little girl who's institutionalized after witnessing the death of her parents, and she escapes into this fantastical world in order to find her cat. And lastly, this is the analysis that I'm just almost finished with, is Hellblade, about a picked warrior who, well, you could say suffers from psychosis, and she hears voices throughout the entire game. And you fight your way into Helheim. It's very mythological, in order to regain the soul of Dillian, of her beloved, to negotiate for the soul of her deceased beloved, and basically get it back from the goddess of Hela.
So of these 5, and we have quite a selection there.
Super different, these games.
Yeah.
Depression Quest is obviously very focused on a specific mental illness. Are any of the other ones focused on any, do they take a more medical model, or I don't know if medical model is kind of the right term, but are they focused on the more general madness, or more of a kind of here's the experience of a specific mental condition?
The interesting thing is that, yes to both, kind of, because the thing is that with Hellblade, I think it's a perfect example. Hellblade is a game where it is clearly marketed as this is supposed to give you an authentic experience of psychosis. Psychosis voice hearing, hallucinations, all of these things. And they developed it in close coordination with people who are personally affected. So they would develop like a vertical slice of like a section where you hear voices, and they would show it to people who actually hear voices. And they would consult them and say, like, is this how it feels? And they would say, like, nah, it's not quite right. And then they would improve upon it until they say, yeah, that's very close to what I'm experiencing. Now, while it's clearly framed as psychosis, the thing is, that game is set in like, I don't know, 800 something. So at that time, psychosis as a concept did not exist. So psychosis is not mentioned at all in the entire game. And that makes it hard to answer because, yes, it is about psychosis, but is it really about psychosis? What is psychosis even? You know?
Right.
Right.
But it's interesting that it is trying very hard to be authentic to the experience.
Yes.
In the same way that Depression Quest is trying to be authentic to that experience.
I think that's one of the most common goals, of making it authentic.
All right, so Stefan, so let me go back to ask the question I wanted to ask before, which is, why madness in video games? What really attracted you to this aspect of video games?
Well, I already alluded to this kind of personal curiosity. I think that most research is motivated by some kind of personal factors, right? There are reasons for why you are curious about one phenomenon and not so much another. But I also think that I always had a great interest in studying the vulnerability of human beings, like this inevitable fact that we have to realize that we are vulnerable beings. That meant that for a long time I was really involved in like gender discourse and discourses on race and so on, discourses on disability, and I think they're all very important, super important actually. I love talking about these subjects. However, I found that madness is one of them that has very much taken like a backseat. When we look at these big axes of what divides societies, what divides people and pits them against each other, then madness is something that was super prominent in the 1960s and 70s, I think. That was like a big thing, with the social psychiatric reform, where big institutions were closed down and people were integrated into communities. Nowadays, it's more like a side phenomenon, unless something concrete happens, where then things arise, such as, is the former president of the United States narcissistic, for example, and suddenly everyone talks about narcissism.
Right.
Or someone goes somewhere and commits a terrible crime, and everyone says, like, well, that must be a psychopath. And suddenly that term gets thrown around very easily. So I think I just had this kind of urge of taking a more systematic approach and looking at it, especially in the context of video games, because there's not much research on it at all so far.
I also think that we've become a lot more casual about the way that we talk about living with mental illness. I know lots of people who are living with mental illness of some kind or another, right? I know lots of people who go and seek therapy and take psychiatric drugs of one kind or another to live their daily lives, and it's sort of become normalized in a way, but madness is not, right? Madness is somewhat separate from like that. The kind of normalized mental illness that we live with day to day, depressions and ADHD and a variety of other things that we are treating and we know our friends have, and it's fine, and it's just we live with it. But then there's madness, right? And that's separate.
Yeah, that's interesting because, of course, that's a divide that we make these days. You know,
madness is always what affects the others, not us. Because the thing is that you can only judge something as mad from a perspective that considers itself to be reasonable, right? You can't say the assumption would be weird to say, let's take a couple of people, all of them are psychotic, and then let's tell them that they should diagnose a person with psychosis. But no, you want someone who has like a medical expertise, who has studied this, there's like empirical evidence and so on, and they can say like, I'm reasonable, and therefore I can judge what is not. So I think that's like a fundamental dynamic that I don't mean this in an evaluative or cynical way. That's just how these things function in our society nowadays. Yeah.
And we can also talk about ourselves in the past, but we're still talking from the frame of reference of I'm reasonable and rational now.
Yeah.
But 2 nights ago, I went a little mad.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is the Ethics of Video Games podcast, and while really the whole topic, I think, connects with ethics, I want to ask about, are there kind of general ethical concerns that you have about the way video games might depict mental illness? Just to kind of give you an example, my students, for their final project, design a video game that deals with some sort of social issue. And I've had plenty of students who've wanted to deal with mental illness and design games about mental illness. But I no longer allow anyone to do it about schizophrenia because it always ends up, and it was all in his head, and they twist, and the entire mental illness just ends up being a mechanic that the game can use instead of a incredibly powerful human experience with a lot of consequences, and there's misrepresentation of what's going on, right? And to me, this was just kind of beyond the pale. Are there any kind of general concerns you have about the way madness could be depicted in video games?
I mean, yes, I do, but I'm not part of I'm not advocating for a huge change in these constructions of madness in video games. I'm trying to rather approach them from a descriptive perspective and learn and understand what it means and what it says about our society that things are constructed in the way they are. But I think one of the most fundamental aspects of constructing madness in video games is, to me, a distinction between objectification and subjectification. This has been lingering in our conversation already. I disambiguate those two by saying that objectification just means that you are gazing at a person who is considered to be mad. Like you're looking at that person. It doesn't mean that you dehumanize them, although that is a subtype, like that can happen, dehumanization and even animalization, of course. But first of all, it only means you're looking at them, whereas subjectification means you are looking from their perspective at the world. And so what you construct is a mad subjectivity. And I think those are like very much two opposing gazes, you could say, that often also are in competition with one another. The one is often, objectification is usually associated with stigmatization, and subjectification rather with empowerment and authenticity. It doesn't always work like that, but that's kind of the schema in which these things operate, yeah.
And video games will intentionally blur that, right? Because let's say I take on a character, like let's say I'm playing a character like in Hellblade. I'm playing a character who has this psychosis and that is her subjective reality in the game. But my subjective reality as a player to the game is now, in some ways, she's the object of the game to me.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that as well. And I think for this, to disambiguate the terms of objectification and subjectification, I decided that I'm only going to operate on the level of game text. Because, of course, if we take the recipient into account, then everything is objectification, because everything in the game is basically the object of our subjective gaze. So that would be another interesting layer to the matter. I haven't studied that. It's not part of my PhD, but I find it a super interesting thought, since there must be some kind of form of kind of translating whatever's happening on the game screen through a process of objectification in order to have any kind of effect on us while playing.
Yeah. And I wonder if games are better or worse at it than other media. I don't know. I don't have a clear idea about that, and it's just sort of an interesting thought to leave out there with our listeners.
Well, so I actually thought that the next thing we would go to is, talk about tropes in video games, tropes of madness in video games, and then, we could ask if they're different from the kind of tropes that we get in other media. So, yeah, so Stefan, what are some of the tropes of madness that we see in video games?
I mean,
or that you found in your 5 games that you're looking at.
Yeah. I'm trying to when I work on these games, on these analyses, I'm constructing a typology, and these types, they are like more broadly conceptualized. Like objectification and subjectification are 2 types. Another type that is a little bit more similar to what you might call a trope is I call it a somatic externalization. That would mean to project madness onto the body of a character. Because madness is something that is inherently not visually palpable, right? You can't see into someone's brain directly or into someone's mind. And therefore, visual media often have the tendency to project such attributes onto the body. It can be with such things like crazy hair, crazy eyes. It can go to the degree of saying, like as I mentioned in Outlast, where you have these like animal type monstrosities roaming the hallways of a institution. Like they barely wear any clothes. They're like bloodied. They are very muscular because often, and that's part of a trope, often mad people in video games are portrayed as, on the one hand, being subhuman since they can't be reasoned with. You can't communicate with them. You can only fight or flee. But on the other hand, they're kind of superhuman because they have a superhuman strength. It's often like their muscles are on display, or they are, even if you want to go to the domain of like a mad scientist, which is also another trope, they have some kind of new comprehension of the universe that eludes other people and that allows them to do some kind of strange experimentation and maybe even reach some kind of research goals and creating a monstrosity that they can control, in exchange, of course, of giving up any kind of morality.
So is the mad scientist trope, I always assumed that it was just that the scientist happened to be mad, more like drunk with power, that led to madness. Are you saying that in some of these tropes, the madness itself is a sort of a superpower, whether it's strength or, extra mental, power?
Yes, the madness would be a kind of superpower in the sense that it liberates the scientist. Because normally a scientist would have to abide by at least by certain ethical regulations, would be bound to not harm people with his inventions or her invention. However, the mad scientist is that's like unbound reason. It's like reason that goes wherever it wants. It's reason that strives for power regardless of the damage that it does. And therefore, madness is in that context, I think, depicted as a kind of superpower, yeah.
That's actually interesting because the way you put it, it's rationality that just ignores something, right?
Exactly.
Which is, so it's not anti-rational in that sense, unless I guess ethics is rational, right? It's more like just I'm wondering if this is kind of one depiction of madness is rationality run amok,
Totally, 100%. The thing is that one of the most historically significant incidents of that happening that is still very, rightfully so, very prevalent in media culture and video games is, of course, the Shoah, right? The Holocaust, because that is often considered to be rationality run amok, since the Nazis had this kind of like obsession with killing people as efficiently as possible, as many as possible, were very efficient and very thorough in their reasoning of how to do it, right? It was all very reasonable, except for the fact that it was, of course, completely inhumane. And
right. Yeah, that's really, though, to go back to the subhuman, there they lost their rationality, it seems almost completely, but they've gained in an animal strength superpower.
Yes, they gained a superpower, they gained a resilience towards any kind of afflictions. That is an idea that originated, according to Michel Foucault, very much with the 16th and 1700s, where people started to be interned in institutions, because that would be a time where madness disappears from the public eye. They get kind of locked up in these institutions, and so people literally lose sight of what madness looks like. Instead, they only hear of it. Like, this is what happens in these institutions where people are locked up in cages, where people are sleeping on the ground, where people are sleeping in their own filth, and where they are in such terrible conditions that by virtue of being in those conditions, they are treated as animals and therefore become animalized.
Wow, that's really interesting. Okay, so far we got at least two. Beside the objective subjective, we got at least two tropes. Can you tell us about any of the more any other tropes that you see of madness in video games?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to these types, one thing that's really common is the mindscape. These are not necessarily all like, character tropes in that sense, because I'm trying to look at it from a more abstract level. But I think the mindscape is one that's super interesting and super broadly popular.
Yeah, and we've been seeing the idea of mindscapes in comic books and in movies and in games for, I don't know, the first time I can think of it was, X-Men in the early 80s with, Professor Xavier and Jean Grey bringing people into the mindscape to have, like personal conversations or even personal fights within this space, and that's, that seems like a rich place to play with within video games. So as a designer, that's sort of exciting, right?
It's super exciting, yeah, because you can, as a video game designer, you are in the situation that you get to design a place that's literally not a place. It's like the mind doesn't have any kind of spatiality to it, and you can get wild when it comes to creating such mindscapes and the way to transition into and out of it. It's super interesting.
And we can talk about, and we can explore what the character is like from a visuospatial sort of way, right? We can talk about the character because we can describe what their mindscape is like. We can actually put you into their mind and see how they think about the world.
So how are the mindscapes of people who are characterized as being mad shown differently than the mindscapes of quote unquote regular people?
The thing is that normally we don't see mindscapes of the regular person, right? Usually,
I mean, do we? I mean,
well, I think we do. I think maybe not in video games, but I think in lots of other media we see the mindscape idea is something that we thinking about, like the X-Men, for example, and we can see Xavier's mind is supposedly a not insane mind, but we see his mindscape, or we'll see inside one of the characters that he is talking to, and they're supposedly not insane. The crazy ones, the insane characters, and their mindscapes become very unreal.
Right. So is it unreal and chaotic as opposed to, right? So in other words, right, when I think about what would be the mindscape of someone who's mad, the first thing that comes to mind is just chaos or narratives that seem to go to weird places or, that I just can't understand what's really going on.
The thing is that chaos, I think, might be a little bit problematic since madness often has a very consistent internal logic in itself. For example, there's a beautiful video game series called Persona. It's a Japanese role-playing game series. And in Persona 5, there is a volleyball coach at a high school, and he abuses students. It's terrible. It's really atrocious. It's a very tough subject matter. And as a group of high schoolers, you get the ability to travel into people's minds. And as you do so, his mindscape is constructed as like a glorious castle in which he is the king. Because that's the way that he perceives himself to be. And there are like projections of students, like especially one particular female student who's like very lightly dressed and kind of like super into him and so on. And it has this kind of very sexual and abusive connotations to it. And there are torture chambers for the incompetent or, annoying students. So it has this kind of internal logic that you could probably best describe as narcissistic in that sense.
Right. So they're basically telling you about what this character is like by creating this environment to move around in in this game.
Yeah, and how he sees himself. And then the tough thing about that is that you need to fight the shadow version of this character in order to, you could say, in a very simplified way, to change the person.
So we've talked about how some of this stuff is, around in other media, right? Like comic books, like films, like books to a degree. But games are also a unique interactive medium. So what do you see as potentially unique to the way madness is depicted in the gaming medium because of the interactivity that you can engage with?
I think the interactivity often plays a crucial part. We mentioned Depression Quest,
Right.
for example,
Right.
where you have this situation that you need to make decisions. It's probably more comparable to a book than to a film because you mostly do reading. But when it comes to decision making, I find it particularly interesting that depression is then depicted as there is a certain choice that you might want to make. You might want to go to that party, or you might want to have an enjoyable evening with your girlfriend. You might want to go to work and do fine or do well or call a therapist, but you can't. It's crossed out. And I think it is super important, even if we look only on the mechanical level of how these choices are presented. They could have just left those options out, but they don't. They show you the option and they show you that it's crossed out so that you think like, oh man, I really would love to click on it. Just like a person that has depression might think, yeah, I know that this is something that I should be doing now, but I can't. That's what it means to be depressed.
So in that game, they're playing with this idea of agency being the kinds of things that we can do as players in a game.
Yes.
By limiting agency, and then you could contrast that with maybe like Hellblade, where they might be giving you more agency because of your psychosis.
Yes, that
like
is a very interesting
things you wouldn't normally do are now available to you.
Yes. Or things that would from the outside look completely absurd, they suddenly make sense because you are seeing the world from the perspective of Senua, the warrior in Hellblade. Yeah, but I think especially the idea of depression is our limitations in agency. That is such a wonderful form of putting it. Well, we are putting it into words here, but Depression Quest just put it into a rule system, into a system to interact with. And I think that's part of the power that video games have to make you actively think about these things as you play with them and as you engage with these systems.
Yeah, I mean, you come into a game assuming that you have agency and that you will essentially get to enact your agency and to be reminded that you don't have the power to do the things you want to do because in this case, something's wrong, right?
It's also very much it's super interesting when it comes to this paradigm of video games. They generally, especially in major productions, come with a huge promise of agency and power. They always emphasize these are all the things you can do. You can go anywhere you want. You can become whoever you want to be. Whereas when it comes to video games that specifically and deliberately engage with the subject of madness, it's often about things that you cannot do, things where you are restricted in some form and where experiencing that, potentially that frustration, is a crucial experience in trying to understand what it means to be in that situation.
So it's interesting because, in these simulation games, right, taking away agency, showing you the limitations of agency seems to fit really well. But it's interesting, this idea of this other kind of game where your madness gives you different agency, greater agency that Andy mentioned, like Hellblade. Is that we're speculating here, but what do you think is the point of that, the power of that, as opposed to simply, you could get gameplay out of creating a superpower out of madness, right? I mean, that would be kind of the cheap way to do it. Is there any good exploration of madness that could come from giving you additional agency that comes out of the madness that you have?
Yes, certainly. I think one of the most common examples that that aren't specifically part of my PhD now, but GTA 5, certainly everyone knows that game. I assume the entire world owns a copy. And the thing is that you've got a character called, what's his name again? Trevor. Exactly, Trevor. Who has this rage mechanic that you can trigger, and that rage mechanic makes him like super powerful. It makes like time flow a little bit more slowly, and the screen kind of turns red, and you're just like shooting at everything. I think that's also a form of course, of like, satisfying like these kind of cravings and that kind of urge of just going wild in such a game, just letting loose without much of a punishment. It's like a little challenge as well, and I think that is indicative of this thing, that's dynamic that Andy has mentioned several times. This desire of, we have to step outside of rationality sometimes. We have to let go of it at a certain point, even if it's only so that we can afterwards, become our normal self in quotation marks, or perform our roles in society again. I think that surely is an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, there's a tabletop role-playing game, Call of Cthulhu. That I'm sure you've talked about it, right? Or you've seen it before.
I'm currently I just read the short story again, Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, based on the H.P. Lovecraft, and so this is very much in the artistic trope of madness, right? So in that game, you not only have your health points, which you can lose and die, you also have sanity points, and you could lose those, and when you get to 0, you go insane, and you can't play that character anymore, and it's effectively, you're out of the game at that point because you've lost your sanity. But you could, at various points, as your sanity drops, because it's very difficult to get your sanity back in that game. You can start to interact more with these other things that are going on that normal humanity doesn't get to interact with, can't see, can't even perceive. But because you've gone a little mad, you can start to perceive these things. You can start to interact with them, and they of course drive you more mad. And that's the whole loop of that game, is to drive characters mad. So that's another way that losing sanity, going into madness, becomes kind of a superpower.
I think that particular board game, that adaptation of Call of Cthulhu, is actually the one that established that mechanic, as far as I'm aware, which also
it's been around for a good long while.
It's still super common in video games as well. The good old-fashioned sanity meter.
Right. So notice this is connected to, right, the game's ability to quantify things, right?
Yeah.
Because games can quantify things. That's one thing that they could keep doing. They could show you where you are in meter-type situations. So tell us about the sanity meters, and what are they like? Are there a variety of different sanity meters?
There's a whole variety of different sanity meters. It can be expressed in all kinds of forms, but I think what it boils down to is always a kind of scale between madness and, between reason and madness. And the more you go in the direction of madness, usually things develop to your disadvantage. And, right. There are important games such as, Call of Cthulhu. There are also video game adaptations of Call of Cthulhu that do exactly the same thing. There are popular series such as Amnesia, where, for example, it's also like, gothic horror. The entire game is about a protagonist who forgot who he is, and you kind of like start to unravel the story of that you might have made yourself intentionally forget who you are. And there are like these monsters roaming the castle, and whenever you look at them, your sanity depletes. And when it reaches like the red zone, then you have like a mental breakdown. You start to hallucinate. You can't really move for a certain while, and you need to calm down. You need to get into the light, and in order to kind of regain some sanity. I think that's very common, and it ties into the medical discourse of sanity, because if there is one form of discourse that likes to quantify things and assign numbers to things, it is science, like medical science. And they need to do that in order to form diagnoses, and they need to give numbers to things, right? They need to quantify. And that's why I think sanity meters are often very much informed by the way that people are diagnosed and treated and so on. Yeah.
Are they? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm immediately skeptical. I'm thinking, I'm thinking of an anxiety meter or something like that. That seems to be maybe the most common, that I've seen. That is rather than like a therapist quantifying, the level of anxiety, the
Yes.
degree of anxiety that a patient would have every time. I would just think this is an easy game mechanic to include. A game mechanic that could just be like, the more you rise on your anxiety meter, the more we're going to have you shake, the harder it's going to be for you to do things. As really necessarily reflecting the true impact that the illness might have on you. Or again, I'm saying illness, and I know that's putting us in the medical model. And I'm not sure about this. I'm speculating here, right? Because on the one hand, I can see this being, from the designer's perspective, just like a really easy mechanic to go with. But I'm concerned that the mechanic is misrepresenting the reality. But obviously also there is a reality where you get more or less anxiety.
Yeah,
Right?
I think,
Right.
but that's exactly what I meant. Like the meter, the sanity meter is an abstraction, right? It's basically, we're trying to take what people subjectively experience, and we are objectifying it. We are putting it into a kind of quantified scale. And that's something that happens a lot. You mentioned an anxiety meter. They're also, like, in the context of PTSD, for example, they're like stress levels that are assessed, and where you as a patient have to then learn to assess for yourself, okay, at which value am I, and where's maybe
Right.
a threshold, like a point of no return, so I need to apply certain skills in order to reduce that. So yes, it's a very easy way, it's a very direct way to adapt such a logic into video games. But that's basically what I meant by it's informed. Maybe I shouldn't have said just natural sciences, but by psychiatric discourse, this kind of
Right.
quantification.
So PTSD is an interesting one, and I used to have a pain app where I would constantly quantify my pain several times a day, right? And I can definitely see that for anxiety, which PTSD obviously would go into. But what about other forms of madness that might be measured in this way? So it's interesting because the sanity meter is a very general term. Are there games where literally it's your sanity is what is being measured?
Oh, but like the player's sanity, like the game is measuring my personal.
No, obviously the
there are
character's
games
sanity.
that there are games that can measure my stress.
Right.
Yeah.
How exactly would they measure the player's stress? I mean, you obviously would need, I'm assuming, heart monitors or.
Yeah, a while back we were playing when I worked at Sony PlayStation, we were playing with controllers that would measure your heart rate and measure the sort of haptic responses to things by having the sensors actually on the controller. And so you could measure like my stress level to a certain degree. And we were even playing with games where if I could control it, I could control the character on screen in a little different way.
That's awesome. So are there games that actually do that actually have something like a sanity meter for the player rather than the character?
Yeah, there are games that do that. These are mostly in the context of games for health. So those would be.
Okay.
I mean, there are fun experiments such as I don't remember its title, but there is a horror game that measures your, I think the either moisture or the tension of your skin or something, and it basically gets more intense the more anxious you are. But a more common example would probably something like Mind Light. Mind Light, that's a game for health, so it's made for children, and it is made for children to learn, for them to learn how to deal with their own anxieties and their stress levels. You have this kind of like light that you carry around, and they're like dark monsters, like spider-like monsters. And they tested with children. They empirically tested which kind of monsters would scare children. Not too much, but they should make them nervous, right? They should unsettle them. And these monsters would like approach you. But if you then, because your heart rate is being measured and so on, if you then get too scared, then the light goes darker and darker and the monsters draw closer. So what you need to do is like you need to take a breath and you need to try and be calm, and then the mind gets the light shines brighter again. So it's kind of a game for health, for children to learn how to deal with stress.
That is super interesting. And yeah, it's interesting. It's like you fail and things get scary, but I'm sure they got a level where, maximal scaredness, right? Because otherwise that could be really really traumatic. So to go back to characters though, right? So the idea of the sanity meter, what would be like an example of a game where it's just literally what is measured is your sanity?
Yeah,
I mean,
that is
rather than a specific element of it.
There is a particularly interesting example, I think. I'm not sure whether I'll be able to include it in my PhD still, because that book gets longer and longer. The thing is that there is a title called Tokyo Dark, in which you play a Detective Ito, and you're trying to unravel the disappearance of your partner, in which the context of which you encounter all kinds of like supernatural things as you explore the underbelly of Tokyo. And that game has several metrics. One of them is sanity, because whenever you encounter something that is, you could say, overwhelming in a very Lovecraftian sense, something that's super unsettling, super scary or shocking, your sanity depletes. If you do such things like you're petting your cat or you're having a refreshing conversation with a friend, your sanity rises. And according to the level of your sanity, the game will unravel in different directions and you will get different endings.
And when we say sanity, what are we talking about? Right. It's interesting because, it's easy to talk about things like anxiety or depression, right? Sanity is such an ambiguous term here.
Yeah, we're talking about the stability of her cognition and her emotions, I think.
Yeah, and this is where it ceases to be like specific and goes back to this idea of madness, which is, a very general term of like not a specific psychosis of any kind.
Right. So it's both emotional and cognitive, right? And that's
I would say so. Yeah. There's one more interesting thing about Tokyo Dark that adds to that, or is like I would say even complicates the sanity meter. They have a neurosis meter that basically works in a similar way. But what they do, and that's interesting from a game designer's perspective, I think as well. You know how there are certain behaviors that you just kind of do when you play a video game that would otherwise be considered to be completely neurotic, such as you speak to the same character several times and see whether they say something different. Or you're pacing back and forth in an area because you don't know how to progress and just click on everything. In Tokyo Dark, if you do that, then that will decrease or it will make you more neurotic, and that again will then exacerbate the effects of your sanity loss.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Wow.
It's like,
that is absolutely brilliant.
It's a really interesting way of playing with the player and making their actions in the game feel significant to the degree that you have to actively think about the status of your sanity and about the actions that you're going to take in accordance to it. So you have to manage your sanity.
That is super interesting.
Yeah, that's super cool.
Stefan, what about this? What about mental health treatment? So therapists, psychiatrists, mental health institutions, meds. Can you tell us anything about how they're depicted in video games?
Well, one of the biggest problems, I think, because you asked me about moral concerns, is the fact that many narratives, this goes for films, for TV shows, and it applies to video games, unfortunately, as well. They tend to make use of like the idea of the horror asylum, where psychiatric institutions are mistreating and abusing patients, where psychiatrists are interested in power or in some form like perverted, or they can like exert mind control, right? Where medication alters your entire being, your entire behavior, and the entire challenge is usually to escape the asylum. I have not encountered an example yet of a modern, contemporary, and humane psychiatry in a video game. Normally, these psychiatric institutions, it's almost like the default. They are places of horror.
Mm-hmm. It goes back to that period of time, I think, that you were talking about earlier, where mental illness was shunted away and people didn't know what it looked like, and so they imagined those horrors that were going on behind these walls of the Arkham Asylum is the classic example, right?
Yeah,
it's outside the city, it's up on a hill, it's this fortress that houses the worst people.
Exactly, the worst people. I think that's a wonderful phrase, because the thing is, these institutions, these secluded asylums, straight from the get-go, they were not specifically designed for the mentally ill, but they were kind of just used to house people who were considered mad, but also criminals, heretics, what we would now call as sex workers, right? Anyone who was kind of a deviant would be locked up behind these walls. And to be fair, the history of psychiatry is a very troubled one.
Right.
For a long time, the society that we live in has done such great and significant harm to people that were diagnosed with a mental illness that I get where this fear, where this stereotype, this trope is coming from. But the idea of perpetuating it, that can be a problem, because it can actually lead to more harm. In the worst case scenario, it can lead to people not seeking help, even though they might need it, because they are scared that if I go to a psychiatrist, well, who knows what kind of perverted person that would be. If I wouldn't want to take medication, because that might change everything, that suddenly I lose all my creativity, or I can't think straight anymore. Like, these kinds of fears, they can be very troubling, and I think that's why we must be cautious in the way we portray them in video games.
And I see how on the one side there's Arkham, which is, for the criminally insane. I mean, right? I mean, that's literally the way it's described. But on the other hand, there's, the trope, I think, that you talked, that sort of is the other trope, which is maybe the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest kind of more tropey, where you're stuck. You get into an institution like that. You let them get their hands on you, and there'll be no way out. You'll tell them you're not crazy. They'll say that's proof that you're crazy.
Yes.
The system will swallow you, and you will end up a drooling mess, right? It feeds into this fear of losing control. And if you're already, dealing with, issues, that have to do with losing control, this is, an even scarier place to go. And I completely agree that this is one place where, on the one hand, I think it's really easy to understand why these tropes speak to us. On the other hand, they can really deter people from getting the kind of help that they need.
Yeah, it's a super fine line to walk, as you say, because it is a problem that these stereotypes are constantly reproduced. On the other hand, it is important that we work through this kind of history of psychiatry and the harm that it has brought about, the harm that it has done to people diagnosed with a mental illness. So it's also, this horror asylum trope is part of a culture of remembrance as well. So it's a fine line to walk, and I think it requires a whole lot of, reflective engagement. I think that's probably the most important part in order to employ it in a way so that it can be used constructively.
All right. Yeah, I'm a believer that anything can be used constructively in a game with sufficient, with sufficient creative engagement. But that's not what you typically see when we're playing a game like this.
No, I was just going to say, and not just games. right? We also see this in television and movies and everything else. And it's just
Absolutely.
insufficient care in the way that these things are used, and just keeps perpetuating these tropes.
But I do think that games tend to a lot of times take their responsibilities to engage with these issues more seriously, more lightly, because they're like, it's just a game, right? And and this is where I think they could do better than that, especially given just how you think about how some of these simulations can be like Depression Quest, and how amazing of an experience that could be creating for someone. If you take it seriously and
absolutely.
All right, Stefan. So one final question. What do you want to leave us with? What do you think, let's say, game developers and players should take from all this? What should they be thinking about?
Okay. So, I think thinking about is already the important cue, because I don't want to say that we should get rid of games that depict horror asylums or the terror of madness. However, I think it's important to have a conscious engagement with it, and to actually maybe do research, talk to people who are affected, and you can still decide in favor of doing a kind of representation that might in hindsight be considered stigmatizing, but you should be aware of what you're doing. I think the worst thing is just not being aware and simply perpetuating stereotypes and tropes, because that's just too easy. It's just a very easy way out. And I would like to help people understand what kind of meanings are implied within these constructions of madness that we've just discussed. Yeah.
Perfect.
All right, Stefan Simond. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated.
All right, play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.